A first-class passenger spent an entire flight humiliating a quiet stranger she thought didn't belong. But when the plane finally landed, she discovered she had been insulting Keanu Reeves all night, and what he said to her at the end left the entire cabin speechless. Main ek high response main 7,000 words ki puri 7-part story nahi de sakta, lekin main is format main part 1, 1,000 words, leak sakta hun, for AP, next, lekin or main part 2, part 3, or aage ko parts dita jonga. Alternative story idea. Title: A first-class Karen mocked a quiet passenger for 8 hours. Then the captain revealed he was Keanu Reeves. Part 1, almost equals 1,000 words. The first-class lounge at Chicago O'Hare Airport was unusually crowded that evening. A powerful thunderstorm had delayed dozens of flights across the country, forcing frustrated travelers to wait for hours. Large windows overlooked the rain-soaked runways where flashes of lightning occasionally illuminated parked aircraft in brilliant white light. Most passengers sat quietly. Some worked on laptops. Others drank coffee while staring at departure screens. The atmosphere was calm despite the delays. Until Melissa Hart arrived. The moment she walked into the lounge, the energy changed. Her designer heels clicked loudly against the polished marble floor as she marched toward the reception desk carrying a luxury handbag worth more than some people's monthly salaries. She didn't smile. She didn't greet anyone. Instead, she immediately frowned. "My flight was delayed again," she announced loudly. The young receptionist offered a polite smile. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. Unfortunately, the weather." "I know about the weather," Melissa interrupted. "What I don't understand is why people who pay premium prices are treated exactly like everyone else." Several nearby travelers looked up briefly before returning to their phones. The receptionist maintained her professional expression. "We're doing everything we can to accommodate passengers." Melissa sighed dramatically. "Of course you are." The receptionist handed her a lounge access card. Melissa snatched it from her hand without saying thank you. Then she walked toward the center of the lounge and selected the most visible seat in the room. Some people enter a room and naturally blend in. Melissa entered rooms intending to dominate them. Within 10 minutes she had already complained about the coffee, criticized the Wi-Fi speed, and lectured an employee about the placement of dessert trays. Nobody argued with her. People simply endured her. Near the far corner of the lounge sat a man dressed in a dark jacket, faded jeans, and worn brown boots. A black duffel bag rested beside his chair. He sat alone near the window reading a paperback novel while occasionally sipping black coffee. Unlike everyone else in the lounge, he seemed completely unaffected by the delays. Calm. Relaxed. Almost peaceful. Melissa noticed him immediately. And for reasons she couldn't explain, he annoyed her. Maybe it was because he looked too casual for the first-class lounge. Maybe it was because he seemed completely comfortable without trying to impress anyone. Or maybe it was because he paid absolutely no attention to her. Whatever the reason, her eyes kept drifting toward him. Eventually she leaned toward a businessman seated nearby. "Interesting dress code," she said. The businessman glanced up. "What?" Melissa nodded toward the quiet man. "Nothing." The businessman followed her gaze. "Oh. He looks lost." The businessman shrugged. "He's probably waiting for a flight like everyone else." Melissa laughed. "Sure." The businessman immediately returned to his laptop. Conversation over. Melissa hated that. People were supposed to agree with her. At least pretend to. Across the room, the quiet man turned another page in his book. Completely unaware. Or completely uninterested. Melissa couldn't tell which. The storm outside intensified. Rain hammered the giant windows while thunder echoed across the runway. Airport announcements repeatedly informed passengers about delays. Hours passed. The lounge became more crowded. Melissa became more irritated. Meanwhile, the quiet man remained exactly the same. Reading. Drinking coffee. Watching rain. Not complaining. Not demanding attention. At one point, an elderly woman struggled with a heavy carry-on bag near the seating area. Before anyone else reacted, the quiet man stood. Need a hand? The woman smiled gratefully. Yes, please. He lifted the bag effortlessly and carried it across the lounge for her. The woman thanked him several times. He simply nodded and returned to his chair. Melissa watched the interaction. Something about it bothered her. People weren't supposed to be that nice. At least not genuinely. Most kindness came with strings attached. People wanted recognition, praise, social media photos. Something. This man seemed happy remaining invisible. An hour later, the delayed boarding announcement finally appeared. Passengers immediately began gathering their belongings. A collective sigh of relief spread through the lounge. Melissa stood quickly. Finally! The quiet man calmly closed his book and placed it inside his duffel bag. Everyone slowly moved toward the gate. Melissa positioned herself near the front of the priority boarding line. Of course she did. Being first mattered to her. The quiet man stood several places behind her. When boarding began, passengers stepped forward one by one. The gate agent scanned tickets with practiced efficiency. Welcome aboard. Enjoy your flight. Have a great evening. Then the quiet man reached the scanner. The gate agent's face instantly brightened. Good evening, Mr. Reeves. Melissa froze. Her head turned slightly. Reeves? The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. But before she could process it, the man had already thanked the gate agent and continued down the jet bridge. Melissa frowned. No. Impossible. Surely not. If that had really been Keanu Reeves, everyone would have recognized him immediately. Right. Still, the name lingered in her thoughts. As she entered the aircraft moments later, she forgot about it entirely. Because she had discovered something much worse. Her assigned seat, 2A, and sitting directly beside 2B, was the quiet man from the lounge. Reading the same book. Drinking another cup of black coffee. Looking perfectly at home. Melissa stopped in the aisle. No. The flight attendant blinked. Ma'am? There's been a mistake. The attendant checked the boarding pass. No mistake, Miss Hart. Melissa stared at the man beside the window. He looked up politely. Hi. Then he smiled. A simple, friendly smile. Melissa immediately disliked him even more. And she had absolutely no idea that before the night was over, the entire plane would know exactly who he was. The aircraft doors closed with a heavy mechanical thud. Outside, rain continued pounding against the windows while lightning flashed across the dark Chicago sky. Inside first class, however, everything felt warm, quiet, and luxurious. Soft amber lighting illuminated the cabin. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle offering champagne and warm towels. Most passengers settled into their seats, relieved that the flight was finally departing after hours of delays. Melissa Hart was not relieved. She was irritated. Very irritated. Because the quiet man from the lounge was still sitting beside her. He had already placed his worn duffel bag in the overhead compartment, and returned to reading his book as if nothing in the world could disturb him. Melissa glanced at him again. Dark jacket. Simple jeans. Old boots. No designer labels. No expensive watch. Nothing about him looked first class. And yet here he was, sitting in one of the most expensive seats on the aircraft. The contradiction bothered her. A flight attendant approached with champagne. Would you care for a drink before takeoff, ma'am? Of course. Melissa accepted the glass immediately. The attendant turned toward the man beside her. And for you, sir? Just coffee, please. The attendant smiled warmly. Right away, Mr. Reeves. Again. That name. Reeves. Melissa watched carefully as the attendant walked away. Something about the interaction seemed unusually familiar. The crew clearly knew him. Not like they knew frequent travelers. More like they genuinely liked him. A few moments later, the attendant returned with coffee. Good to see you again. The man smiled. You too. Melissa noticed everything. The warmth. The respect. The familiarity. It irritated her. The aircraft began taxiing toward the runway. Passengers fastened seatbelts. Safety announcements played overhead. Then, finally, the engines roared. The plane accelerated into the stormy night. A few seconds later, they were airborne. Chicago disappeared beneath the clouds. The seatbelt sign remained on for several minutes as turbulence rattled the aircraft. Nothing severe. Just enough shaking to make passengers uncomfortable. Melissa hated turbulence. She gripped her armrest. The man beside her calmly continued reading. As if they were sitting in a library instead of flying through a thunderstorm. Eventually the ride smoothed out. The seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers relaxed. Dinner service began shortly afterward. Melissa ordered filet mignon and red wine. The man ordered grilled chicken and another coffee. Again with the coffee. Who drank coffee on a night flight? Apparently he did. The meal arrived. Passengers began eating. For several minutes, silence filled the cabin. Then Melissa finally spoke. So? The man looked up politely. So? You travel often? Sometimes. That was it. Sometimes. Melissa waited. Nothing else came. Business? A little. Again. Short answers. No details. No bragging. Nothing. Melissa found it incredibly frustrating. Most people love talking about themselves. Especially successful people. This man seemed completely uninterested. She tried again. You from Los Angeles? Not exactly. What does that mean? He smiled slightly. It means not exactly. Then he returned to his meal. Melissa stared at him. Was he doing this intentionally? Nobody answered questions like that. Across the aisle, an older couple exchanged amused looks. They had been quietly observing the interaction. The husband hid a smile behind his wine glass. Melissa noticed. Her irritation grew. A few minutes later she tried a different approach. You know, she said casually, air travel used to feel different. The man looked up. Different how? There were standards. He nodded. Okay. People dress better. Another nod. Maybe. Not maybe. Melissa gestured vaguely around the cabin. People respected the experience. The man considered that. Then he surprised her. I think people are probably the same. What? People. He took a sip of coffee. I think they've always been mostly the same. Melissa frowned. Clearly not. The man smiled politely. Maybe. Then he returned to reading. Again. Always the same. Calm. Patient. Unbothered. Melissa felt like she was arguing with a wall. Hours passed. The cabin lights dimmed. Most passengers settled into the quiet rhythm of overnight travel. Some watched movies. Others slept. The older couple across the aisle reclined their seats and disappeared beneath blankets. Melissa couldn't sleep. She kept glancing toward the man beside her. Every time she looked, he seemed perfectly content. Reading. Thinking. Looking out the window. Never complaining. Never seeking attention. Eventually she noticed something strange. People seemed to know him. Not everyone. But enough. One flight attendant stopped to chat briefly. A pilot passing through the cabin nodded at him. Another crew member smiled and asked about a recent trip. The conversations were short. Friendly. Natural. The kind people have with someone they genuinely respect. Melissa didn't like that. Not because she wanted attention. Well, maybe she did. But mostly because she couldn't understand it. Nothing about him looked important. Yet everyone treated him like he mattered. Around midnight cabin time, A young boy from several rows back wandered toward first class while his mother followed behind. The child couldn't have been older than 8. As they passed, he suddenly froze. His eyes widened. "Mom!" The mother looked down. "What is it?" The boy pointed toward Melissa's seat, specifically toward the man beside her. The mother's eyes widened instantly. "Oh!" She quickly lowered the child's hand. The man noticed. He smiled. The child looked starstruck. The mother looked embarrassed. "Sorry to bother you." "No bother." The child hesitated. Then quietly asked, "Are you really?" The mother interrupted immediately. "Sorry." But the man shook his head gently. "It's okay." He looked at the boy. "What's your name?" "Ethan." "Nice to meet you, Ethan." The boy grinned. Then the man extended his hand. The child shook it excitedly. Melissa watched the entire exchange. Something clicked inside her mind. The voice. The face. The name. The recognition. Suddenly the answer arrived. And her stomach dropped. No. It couldn't be. She stared at him. Really stared. The beard. The eyes. The calm smile. The voice. The realization hit her like lightning. Keanu Reeves. The actor. One of the most famous actors in the world. John Wick. The Matrix. Speed. It was him. The quiet man she'd spent hours judging. The quiet man she'd practically mocked in the lounge. The quiet man sitting beside her right now. Her heart skipped. For several seconds she simply stared. The little boy and his mother returned to their seats. The cabin became quiet again. Melissa looked forward. Then back at him. Then forward again. Her thoughts raced. Suddenly every interaction from the evening made sense. The gate agent. The crew. The recognition. The respect. Everything. Yet somehow that realization didn't make her feel relieved. It made her feel worse. Because now she remembered every assumption she'd made. Every judgment. Every dismissive glance. Every cruel thought. And the horrifying part? None of them would have changed if he weren't famous. That truth lingered in her mind. For the first time that evening, Melissa stopped looking down on him. Instead, she found herself wondering something far more uncomfortable. What kind of person judges someone before even knowing them? And why had she done it so easily? Outside the window, the aircraft continued west through the darkness. Far below, cities glowed like scattered diamonds. Inside first class, most passengers slept peacefully. But Melissa's heart remained wide awake. Because the flight was no longer It was about the person she was beginning to see in herself. And that realization was far harder to escape. The realization refused to leave Melissa's mind. Even after another hour passed, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Keanu Reeves. The name echoed endlessly inside her head while the aircraft cruised through the darkness high above the American Midwest. Most of the cabin had fallen asleep. Reading lights glowed softly above a few seats. Blankets covered sleeping passengers. The quiet hum of the engines created a peaceful rhythm throughout first class. Yet Melissa remained wide awake. Every time she glanced sideways, Keanu seemed completely relaxed. At one point he closed his book and simply looked out the window. Moonlight reflected faintly across the clouds below. For several minutes he sat silently watching them. No phone. No laptop. No assistant. No entourage. Just a man looking at the night sky. Melissa couldn't understand it. Someone with that level of fame should have been different. More demanding. More important. More aware of his own celebrity. Instead, he behaved like the least important person on the plane. Around 1:30 a.m., most cabin lights were turned off completely. The flight settled into deep overnight silence. Melissa finally reclined her seat and closed her eyes. Sleep never came. Her thoughts kept returning to earlier events in the lounge. The complaints. The comments. The judgments. The way she looked at him, and immediately decided he didn't belong. Now those moments felt embarrassing. Not because he was famous. Because she'd been wrong. Completely wrong. A sudden voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me." Melissa opened her eyes. A flight attendant stood beside her seat. "Would you like another blanket?" Melissa nodded. "Sure." The attendant handed it over politely. Then she turned toward Keanu. "Need anything?" "No thanks." The attendant smiled warmly. "Just checking." After she walked away, Melissa couldn't stop herself. "Do they always do that?" Keanu looked over. "Do what?" "Treat you differently." He understood immediately. A faint smile crossed his face. "I don't think they do." Melissa laughed softly. "They definitely do." He shrugged. "Maybe they're just nice people." The simplicity of the answer surprised her. Again. No ego. No mention of fame. Nothing. Melissa shook her head. "You know, most celebrities would love this attention." Keanu considered that for a moment. "Maybe. You don't?" He looked out the window. "Attention isn't always the same thing as happiness." The answer lingered between them. Melissa found herself unexpectedly curious. Not because he was famous. Because he seemed different. Authentic. The kind of person she rarely encountered. For a while neither spoke. Then something unexpected happened. The aircraft hit turbulence. Hard turbulence. The plane suddenly dropped. Several passengers woke immediately. A glass rattled across a tray table. Someone gasped. Then another violent shake rolled through the cabin. The seatbelt sign illuminated instantly. A captain's announcement followed seconds later. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts immediately." The aircraft lurched again. A child cried somewhere farther back. Passengers grabbed armrests. Flight attendants secured themselves quickly. Melissa felt panic rising in her chest. She hated flying. Always had. The shaking intensified. Not dangerous. But uncomfortable. Enough to frighten people. The little boy from earlier, Ethan, began crying. His mother tried comforting him. "It's okay." Another sharp jolt interrupted her. Ethan cried harder. Passengers exchanged nervous looks. An elderly man near the center section looked pale. Several people reached for call buttons. The atmosphere changed instantly. Fear spread quickly inside confined spaces. Melissa gripped her armrests. Her knuckles turned white. Then she noticed something. Keanu wasn't afraid. Not even slightly. Instead, he unfastened his blanket and leaned gently toward the aisle. "Ethan." The boy looked up through tears. "You remember roller coasters?" The child nodded. "This is like that." The plane shook again. Keanu smiled calmly. "Except pilots train for this every day." The boy listened. Still crying. But quieter now. "You know something?" "What?" "The plane wants to fly." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" Keanu pointed gently toward the window. "Planes are built to stay up there." Another shake passed. The child looked less frightened. Passengers nearby listened too. Not just the boy. Everyone. Because calmness is contagious. Especially during fear. A flight attendant caught Keanu's eye from across the cabin. She looked relieved. The turbulence continued for nearly 10 minutes. Then gradually faded. The aircraft smoothed out. Passengers relaxed. Conversations resumed. The danger passed. But something else remained. Respect. People had witnessed the difference between confidence and status. Melissa noticed it clearly. When everyone became afraid, nobody looked toward the loudest person. Nobody looked toward the richest person. Nobody looked toward the most demanding passenger. They looked toward the calmest one. The person who made others feel safe. That realization struck harder than any turbulence. The cabin slowly settled again. Passengers returned to sleep. Lights dimmed. silence returned. But now the atmosphere around Keanu had changed. Several passengers quietly thanked him. The elderly man who had looked frightened earlier nodded gratefully. Ethan's mother mouthed a silent, "Thank you?" Keanu simply smiled. As though none of it mattered. As though helping people was normal. Melissa watched every interaction. And the more she watched, the more uncomfortable she became. Not because of him. Because of herself. For years she had measured people using the wrong standards. Money. Clothing. Status. Titles. Connections. Yet none of those things had mattered tonight. Not when people needed reassurance. Not when someone needed kindness. Not when fear entered the cabin. Character mattered. And character couldn't be purchased. The realization sat heavily in her chest. An hour later, while most passengers slept again, Melissa quietly spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Keanu looked over. "Sure." "Why didn't you get angry?" He seemed confused. "When?" "Earlier." She swallowed. "In the lounge." The cabin remained quiet around them. Only engine noise filled the darkness. Keanu thought for a moment. Then shrugged. "I don't know." "You don't know?" "Not really." Melissa stared. "I would have gotten angry." He smiled slightly. "Probably. You should have." Another smile. "Maybe." The answer frustrated her. "Seriously." Keanu leaned back. Then finally answered. "My dad used to tell me something." Melissa waited. "He said everybody's fighting a battle you know nothing about." The words hung between them. So maybe when people are angry." He paused. "They're usually carrying something heavier than anger." Melissa looked away. For reasons she couldn't explain, those words affected her deeply. Because they felt true. Painfully true. Outside the window, the night sky stretched endlessly across the horizon. Inside the aircraft, silence returned. Melissa stared forward. Thinking. Reflecting. Questioning things she'd never questioned before. And somewhere deep inside, something uncomfortable was happening. For the first time in years. She wasn't judging someone else. She was judging herself. And she wasn't liking what she saw. The flight still had several hours remaining. But Melissa was beginning to understand that the most important journey wasn't happening across the country. It was happening inside her. And by the time the plane reached Los Angeles, nothing would feel quite the same again. The night slowly gave way to morning. Far beyond the aircraft windows, a thin line of silver appeared on the horizon. The darkness that had surrounded the plane for hours was beginning to retreat, replaced by the first signs of dawn. Most passengers remained asleep. Blankets covered seats. Reading lights glowed faintly. The engines hummed steadily as the aircraft crossed the final stretch of its journey toward Los Angeles. But Melissa Hart couldn't sleep. Not anymore. Too much had happened. Too many thoughts crowded her mind. She glanced toward Keanu Reeves again. He was asleep now. For the first time during the flight. His seat was slightly reclined, his hands folded loosely across a blanket, his face relaxed and peaceful. There was something strange about watching someone famous sleep. Not because they looked special. Because they looked ordinary. Human. The same as everyone else. Melissa studied him for a moment before quickly looking away. Hours earlier she had looked at this man and seen someone beneath her. Now she couldn't stop wondering how many other people she'd misjudged throughout her life. The thought made her uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Because once you start questioning one assumption, others follow. And Melissa had built her entire identity around assumptions. Assumptions about success. Assumptions about status. Assumptions about who mattered and who did. Patiently. Professionally. Melissa watched her for several moments. Then she remembered something. Back in the lounge. The sparkling water. The lime. The lemon. The complaint. The unnecessary embarrassment she'd caused. At the time it had felt justified. Now it felt ridiculous. The memory made her cringe. For perhaps the first time in years, Melissa wished she could go back and undo something she'd said. A few minutes later, Keanu stirred awake. He blinked slowly and looked out the window. The sunrise was now visible. Golden light stretched across endless clouds. The view was breathtaking. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Keanu smiled slightly. Nice. Melissa looked outside. It is. A brief silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. Melissa spoke before she could stop herself. I'm not a very nice person sometimes. The words surprised even her. Keanu turned toward her. Not shocked. Not judgmental. Just listening. Melissa laughed softly. A bitter laugh. Actually, that's probably the understatement of the year. Keanu remained quiet, giving her space, allowing her to continue. Most people interrupt. Most people rush to fix conversations. Keanu simply listened. And somehow that made honesty easier. I spend so much time judging people. Melissa stared toward the sunrise. I don't even realize I'm doing it half the time. Still, he didn't interrupt. I look at someone's clothes. She swallowed. Their job. Their car. The way they talk. And I've already decided who they are. The cabin remained silent around them. A few passengers nearby were awake now, though none appeared to be listening. Melissa continued anyway. I always thought that meant I was observant. A sad smile crossed her face. Maybe it just means I'm shallow. For several seconds Heather spoke. Finally, Keanu answered. Everybody has blind spots. Melissa looked at him. Not like mine. You'd be surprised. She shook her head. No. Then after a pause. You know what bothers me most? What? Melissa sighed. It wasn't because you were famous. Keanu waited. I would have treated any ordinary person exactly the same way. The confession hung heavily between them. For the first time since boarding the plane, she wasn't defending herself. She wasn't making excuses. She wasn't blaming anyone else. She was simply telling the truth. And the truth hurt. Keanu nodded slowly. I appreciate your honesty. Melissa laughed again. Honesty doesn't exactly fix it. No. It doesn't. The sunrise brightened. Golden light spilled across the cabin. Passengers gradually woke. The overnight quietness began disappearing. Morning had arrived. And with it came reality. The flight would land soon. The internet would still exist. The videos would still exist. The consequences would still exist. Melissa knew that. She felt sick every time she thought about it. As if reading her mind, Keanu spoke quietly. You can't change yesterday. Melissa stared ahead. No. But you can decide what you do next. The sentence sounded simple. Yet it landed with unexpected force. Because for hours she'd been trapped inside regret. Obsessing over mistakes. Embarrassment. Humiliation. What people thought. What people were saying. But she hadn't spent much time thinking about the future. What happened next? What she would become after this? The idea felt strangely freeing. A flight attendant approached with coffee. The same elderly attendant Melissa had criticized in the lounge. When she reached their row, Melissa felt a knot form in her stomach. The woman smiled professionally. Coffee? Melissa hesitated. Then took a breath. Actually. The attendant paused. Yes, ma'am? Melissa looked directly at her. Something she rarely did with service workers. Usually she looked through them. Past them. Not at them. I'm sorry. The attendant blinked. What? Melissa swallowed. Back in the lounge. A long silence followed. The attendant clearly wasn't expecting this. Neither was anyone nearby. I was rude. Melissa continued. Very rude. The attendant stared for a moment. Then her expression softened. Slightly. Thank you? That was all. Just 2 words. Yet Melissa felt relief wash through her. Not because she was forgiven. Because she'd finally taken responsibility. The attendant moved on. Keanu watched quietly. No comments. No praise. No congratulations. Just a small approving smile. And somehow that felt better than any speech. The plane continued westward. Sunlight now filled the cabin completely. Passengers stretched. Gathered belongings. Checked phones. Prepared for arrival. Meanwhile, Melissa sat quietly. Thinking. Reflecting. Learning. For years she had believed respect came from status. Tonight had proven otherwise. Real respect came from behavior. From kindness. From character. Things she had neglected for far too long. About an hour before landing, the captain made another announcement. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'll begin our descent into Los Angeles shortly. Passengers immediately became more active. Seat backs adjusted. Laptops disappeared. Window shades opened. The journey was almost over. Melissa looked toward the front of the cabin. A strange feeling settled inside her. Fear. Not fear of flying. Fear of what awaited after landing. The videos. The headlines. The embarrassment. The consequences. She glanced at Keanu. What happens now? He looked at her. You land. Melissa smiled weakly. You know what I mean. A small grin appeared on his face. Yeah. For a moment he considered the question. Then he answered. The truth usually survives longer than public outrage. Melissa frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means people eventually move on. He looked out the window. But the lessons stay. The lessons stay. Melissa repeated the words silently. And for the first time all flight. She hoped he was right. Because when this journey ended, she would need those lessons more than anyone. The atmosphere inside the cabin changed noticeably once the captain announced the descent. People who had spent most of the night sleeping suddenly became active. Window shades lifted. Phones appeared. Laptops were stored away. Passengers stretched, checked messages, and prepared themselves for arrival. Outside the windows, California slowly emerged beneath the morning sunlight. The endless darkness of the night had disappeared. Mountain ranges appeared in the distance. Small towns and highways stretched across the landscape below. Everything looked peaceful. Melissa wished she felt the same. Instead, anxiety sat heavily in her chest. The closer they came to Los Angeles, the harder it became to ignore reality. For hours she had been trapped inside a metal tube flying above the country. There had been nowhere to go. No internet connection for most of the flight. No real consequences yet. Now that was about to change. The world was waiting on the ground. And so were the videos. Melissa stared at her phone. The screen remained dark. She almost didn't want to turn it on. Part of her hoped the entire situation had somehow disappeared overnight. A ridiculous hope. But a hope nonetheless. Beside her, Keanu looked completely relaxed. He gazed out the window while drinking coffee. No signs of stress. No signs of anger. No signs that millions of people might soon be discussing something connected to him. That calmness amazed her. Finally, Melissa took a deep breath and unlocked her phone. The screen immediately exploded with notifications. Dozens. Then hundreds. Messages. Emails. Missed calls. Social media alerts. Her stomach dropped. Oh no. Keanu glanced over but said nothing. Melissa opened her messages first. The earliest texts came from friends. Then coworkers. Then family members. Most contained variations of the same question. Is this really you? Melissa, call me. What happened? I just saw a video. Some messages sounded concerned. Others sounded disappointed. A few sounded angry. The worst ones came from people who knew her well. People who weren't surprised. That hurt more than anything. Because it suggested this wasn't an isolated incident. Maybe this was how people secretly saw her all along. Melissa opened social media next. The moment she did, her heart sank. The videos had spread far beyond anything she imagined. One clip showed her criticizing Keanu's appearance. Another showed him calmly responding. Another captured the turbulence incident. Millions of views. Hundreds of thousands of comments. News accounts had already reposted the story. Entertainment pages were covering it. Discussion channels were analyzing it. Everyone seemed focused on the same contrast. Her arrogance. His kindness. Melissa closed the app immediately. She couldn't keep reading. Across the aisle, a businessman noticed her expression. For a moment their eyes met. Then he looked away. Not hostile. Not mocking. Just uncomfortable. Melissa hated that. She'd rather people be angry. Pity felt worse. A flight attendant passed through the aisle collecting final cups. The atmosphere among the crew seemed different now. Not because they were treating Melissa badly. Because they were treating her normally. For years she'd confused special treatment with respect. Now she understood the difference. Several rows behind them, whispers began spreading again. Passengers checked phones. Some recognized the growing story online. Others searched for it after hearing conversations. The realization moved quietly through the cabin. The situation was no longer private. Not even close. Melissa felt exposed. The plane continued descending. Los Angeles grew larger beneath them. Highways twisted through the city like silver ribbons. Buildings sparkled in the morning light. The Pacific Ocean appeared on the horizon. Normally Melissa loved arriving in Los Angeles. The city represented opportunity. Status. Success. Now it felt like a courtroom. Every mile closer increased her anxiety. Eventually she noticed something strange. Despite the attention surrounding the story, Keanu wasn't looking at his phone. Not once. Not even out of curiosity. That puzzled her. You haven't checked anything? He looked over. Checked what? The internet. A small smile appeared. No. Why? He shrugged. It'll still be there later. Melissa stared. That answer perfectly captured everything she'd learned about him during the flight. Most people chased attention. Whether positive or negative. Most people obsessed over public opinion. Keanu seemed focused on something else entirely. Reality. The people physically around him. The moment he was living in. Not the digital storm happening elsewhere. A young flight attendant approached their row. Mr. Reeves? Yeah? She hesitated. Then smiled. My brother's a huge fan. Keanu smiled back. That's nice. He wanted me to tell you your movies helped him through a difficult time. The sincerity in her voice was obvious. Keanu's expression softened. Tell him I'm glad he's still here. The flight attendant nodded. A little emotional now. Thank you. She walked away. Melissa watched the exchange silently. It lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet it revealed something important. The flight attendant hadn't admired him because he was rich or famous. She admired him because of how his work had impacted someone's life. Influence. Real influence. Not the kind measured by luxury handbags or executive titles. The kind measured by helping people. Melissa looked out the window. For the first time in years, many of her accomplishments felt strangely empty. She had spent decades climbing social ladders, building professional networks, acquiring status symbols, chasing appearances. But how many lives had she genuinely improved? The question bothered her. Because she didn't like the answer. The aircraft descended lower. Neighborhoods became visible. Cars moved along highways. Baseball fields. Schools. Parks. Ordinary life. People beginning ordinary mornings. None of them knew they were about to become part of the worst day of Melissa Hart's life. A vibration passed through the cabin as the landing gear lowered. The captain made another announcement. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Passengers straightened in their seats. Seatbelts tightened. Phones disappeared temporarily. The runway appeared ahead. Melissa felt her pulse quicken. This was it. No more delaying. No more hiding inside the aircraft. The wheels touched down with a loud screech. Applause broke out from several passengers. Reverse engines roared. The plane slowed. And just like that, the flight was over. Or rather, the flight was over. The consequences were beginning. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, cellular service returned fully. Notification sounds echoed throughout the cabin. Phones lit up everywhere. Melissa's device vibrated continuously. Messages arriving faster than she could read them. One email immediately cog. It came from her company. Her stomach tightened. She didn't open it. Not yet. She wasn't ready. Around her, passengers stood and retrieved luggage. Conversations resumed. The journey had ended for them. For Melissa, it felt like everything was just beginning. Then something unexpected happened. An older woman from several rows back approached Keanu. Not excited. Not starstruck. Just sincere. "I wanted to thank you." Keanu smiled politely. "For what?" The woman glanced toward her granddaughter. "For showing her how to stay kind when someone isn't." The words landed heavily. Not just on Keanu. On Melissa too. The woman wasn't trying to shame her. That somehow made it worse. Because it was true. The grandmother returned to her seat. The little girl smiled shyly at Keanu before leaving. A simple moment. Yet Melissa would remember it for years. Because it perfectly summarized everything she'd failed to understand. Respect wasn't demanded. It was earned. And kindness earned it more reliably than power ever could. As passengers slowly exited into the jet bridge, Melissa remained seated for a moment. Watching. Thinking. Wondering what awaited outside. And for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't worried about protecting her image. She was worried about becoming a better person than the one who boarded this flight. The cabin emptied quickly. Within minutes, only a handful of passengers remained near the front of the aircraft. Most travelers were already moving through the jet bridge toward the terminal, eager to begin their day in Los Angeles. Melissa Hart remained seated. Her hands rested tightly around her phone. She wasn't ready to stand. She wasn't ready to face the world waiting outside. For the first time in years, confidence had abandoned her completely. The woman who had walked through the Chicago lounge acting as if she owned every room now felt afraid to walk through an airport terminal. Not because of danger. Because of judgment. And because deep down, she knew she had earned it. A flight attendant approached gently. "Ma'am, we're ready to deplane." Melissa nodded. "Right." Her voice sounded small. Almost unfamiliar. She stood slowly and reached for her handbag. Beside her, Keanu lifted his old duffel bag from the overhead compartment. The same worn bag she'd silently judged hours earlier. Now it looked different. Not because the bag had changed. Because she had. As passengers filed toward the exit, Melissa followed several steps behind Keanu. The jet bridge felt strangely quiet. Nobody rushed him. Nobody crowded him. A few people recognized him and smiled respectfully. He smiled back. Simple. Natural. Nothing forced. The further they walked, the more obvious the difference became. People respected him because of who he was. Not because of what he owned. That realization followed Melissa like a shadow. When they entered the terminal, reality arrived immediately. Two young travelers standing near a coffee kiosk looked up from their phones. One whispered something. The other glanced directly at Melissa. Recognition. Instant recognition. Her stomach dropped. A few steps later it happened again. Then again. Not everyone knew her face. But enough people did. Enough to make the walk uncomfortable. Melissa lowered her eyes. Every whisper felt louder than it probably was. Every glance felt heavier. Meanwhile, people occasionally recognized Keanu too. But their reactions were completely different. Warm smiles. Respectful nods. A quiet hello. Nothing hostile. Nothing cruel. Watching the contrast hurt. Not because she envied him. Because she understood it. Near the baggage claim area, Melissa's phone vibrated again. Then again. And again. Finally, she stopped walking and looked at the screen. The email from her company remained unopened. She took a deep breath and tapped it. Her heartbeat accelerated immediately. The message was short. Professional. Cold. The company wanted a meeting. Immediately. Not next week. Not tomorrow. Today. Melissa closed her eyes briefly. She knew what that meant. Even if they didn't fire her, the damage had already begun. Her reputation inside the company would never be the same. Years of carefully crafted professionalism had collapsed overnight. Not because someone lied about her. Because people finally saw her clearly. That truth hurt more than any punishment. When she opened her eyes again, she realized Keanu had stopped walking several feet ahead. He noticed she wasn't following. For a moment he waited. Not impatiently. Just waiting. Melissa walked toward him slowly. I got an email. He nodded. Yeah. They want a meeting. Again, he nodded. Neither pretended not to understand what that meant. For a few moments they stood beside a large terminal window overlooking the airport. Planes moved across the runways. Ground crews worked below. Morning sunlight filled the glass. Melissa stared outside. I think I ruined my life. The words came out quietly. Honest. Raw. Keanu remained silent for several seconds. Then he spoke. No. Melissa laughed bitterly. No? No. He looked toward the runway. You made mistakes. Publicly. Big ones. She folded her arms. That sounds like ruining my life. A faint smile crossed his face. No. He shook his head. Ruining your life would be refusing to learn from it. The words landed harder than she expected. Because they contained something she hadn't considered. A future. Until now she'd only been thinking about consequences. Punishment. Embarrassment. Loss. She hadn't thought about growth. About becoming different. Keanu continued. Everybody fails. Melissa looked at him. Not like this. He laughed softly. You'd be surprised. For the first time all morning she smiled. A small smile. But a real one. They stood quietly for another moment. Then Melissa asked the question that had been bothering her all night. Why were you so patient with me? Keanu looked genuinely surprised. I don't know. Come on. I'm serious. He thought for a second. Then shrugged. My mom used to tell me something. Melissa waited. He smiled. She said being kind is easy when people deserve it. The smile faded slightly. The hard part is being kind when they don't. Melissa looked away. Because she definitely hadn't deserved it. Not for most of the flight. Not after the lounge. Not after the comments. Yet somehow he'd still chosen patience. Still chosen grace. Still chosen kindness. A painful lump formed in her throat. For a moment neither spoke. Passengers continued moving around them. Airport announcements echoed overhead. Life moved forward. Eventually Melissa took a deep breath. I'm sorry. The words felt different this time. Not like an apology offered because she was caught. Not because videos existed. Not because consequences were coming. A real apology. The kind that costs something. She met his eyes. I'm genuinely sorry. Keanu studied her quietly. Then nodded once. I know. No speech. No dramatic forgiveness. Just 3 simple words. I know. And somehow those words carried more weight than anything else he could have said. Melissa felt tears sting her eyes. She quickly looked away. Embarrassed. But not because she was crying. Because she finally understood what shame actually was. Not being exposed. Not being criticized. Not being humiliated. Shame was realizing you had become someone you didn't want to be. And deciding to change. After a few moments, Keanu adjusted the strap of his duffel bag. Well? Melissa nodded. Yeah. They both knew the conversation was ending. Different paths. Different lives. Different futures. Keanu extended his hand. Melissa looked at it. Then shook it. His grip was firm. Simple. Nothing dramatic. Good luck, he said. Melissa swallowed. Thanks. Then he smiled. One final time. And turned toward the terminal exit. Melissa watched him walk away. No security team. No entourage. No performance. Just a man carrying an old duffel bag through an airport. Yet somehow everyone around him seemed brighter. Lighter. Happier. Because of the way he treated people. Melissa stood there for a long time after he disappeared into the crowd. Thinking. Reflecting. Understanding. The meeting still waited. The consequences still waited. The difficult conversations still waited. But something had changed. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about how to protect her reputation. She was thinking about how to earn one. And that made all the difference. Melissa Hart stood alone near the terminal window long after Keanu Reeves disappeared into the morning crowd. Around her, Los Angeles International Airport was fully awake. Travelers hurried toward connections. Families reunited near baggage claim. Business executives rushed through the terminal carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Life continued moving forward. But Melissa felt as though time had slowed. For nearly 12 hours, she had been forced to confront something she had spent years avoiding. Herself. Not the polished version she showed colleagues. Not the confident version she presented at networking events. Not the successful executive displayed on social media. The real version. And she didn't particularly like what she had seen. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. Then another. Melissa finally looked down. One text came from her younger sister, Emma. Unlike the others, it wasn't angry. It wasn't judgmental. It simply said, "Call me when you're ready. I love you." Melissa stared at the screen. A lump formed in her throat. For years, Emma had tried warning her. Not directly. Never cruelly. But gently. Whenever Melissa dismissed waiters. Whenever she mocked strangers. Whenever she. Everyone had noticed. They simply stopped saying anything. Because people eventually stop correcting behavior that never changes. Melissa closed her eyes briefly. Then picked up her luggage and began walking. An hour later, she sat inside a conference room at her company's Los Angeles office. The meeting was exactly as uncomfortable as she expected. 3 senior executives sat across from her. None looked angry. Disappointed. Concerned. Careful. Those expressions hurt more. One executive folded his hands. "Melissa, do you understand why we're concerned?" She nodded. "Yes." Another executive slid a printed article across the table. One of the videos had already been picked up by major news outlets. The headline included her name. Her full name. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were real. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, the CEO leaned forward. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" Months earlier, Melissa would have defended herself. Explained. Justified. Blamed stress. Blamed travel delays. Blamed misunderstandings. This time she didn't. She looked directly at them. And told the truth. "I was wrong." The room became silent. "I treated people badly." She swallowed. "I judged someone I didn't know." Another pause. And honestly, her voice softened. It wasn't the first time. The executives exchanged glances. Not because they were shocked. Because they appreciated the honesty. For nearly 30 minutes they discussed the situation. The company's reputation. Public reaction. Future expectations. When the meeting finally ended, Melissa still faced consequences. She would lose certain responsibilities. Certain opportunities. Certain privileges. But she kept her job. Barely. And as she walked out of the building afterward, she realized something surprising. She wasn't angry. Months ago, she would have considered the outcome unfair. Now it felt deserved. Growth begins when excuses end. And for the first time in a very long while, Melissa had stopped making excuses. The weeks that followed were difficult. Very difficult. The internet eventually moved on, just as Keanu predicted. Another story replaced hers. Then another. Then another. That part happened quickly. But the lessons stayed. Exactly as he said they would. Melissa noticed things she had ignored for years. The way she spoke to service workers. The way she interrupted people. The assumptions she made about strangers. The subtle ways she measured human worth through appearance and status. Changing those habits wasn't easy. Habits built over decades rarely disappear overnight. But she worked on them. Every day. Sometimes successfully. Sometimes not. The important thing was that she finally saw them. You can't change what you refuse to recognize. And for the first time, Melissa was paying attention. 3 months later, something unexpected happened. She found herself back in an airport. This time in Denver. A business trip. Nothing unusual. While waiting for her flight, she stopped at a small coffee stand. The young employee behind the counter looked overwhelmed. The line stretched across the terminal. Several customers were complaining. The employee looked exhausted. Melissa recognized the expression immediately. Because she used to be one of the people causing it. When her turn arrived, the young woman apologized. "I'm sorry for the wait." Melissa smiled. A genuine smile. "No worries." The employee looked surprised. Then relieved. It was a tiny interaction. Barely 10 seconds long. Yet Melissa walked away thinking about it. Because years earlier, she would have responded differently. Impatiently. Critically. Entitled. Now she understood something she hadn't understood before. Every person you meet is carrying something invisible. Stress. Fear. Loss. Pressure. Heartbreak. You rarely know what it is. Which is exactly why kindness matters. Later that evening, after arriving home, Melissa sat alone in her apartment overlooking the city. The sunset painted the skyline gold and orange. A familiar memory surfaced. The sunrise over the clouds. The flight. The conversation. Keanu's final words. "Ruining your life would be refusing to learn from it." At the time, she wasn't sure she believed him. Now she did. Because her life hadn't been ruined. It had been interrupted. Corrected. Redirected. Painfully. Publicly. But maybe necessarily. Sometimes growth arrives through encouragement. Other times it arrives through embarrassment. The lesson matters more than the delivery. Melissa picked up her phone and opened an email she'd been writing for days. It wasn't for her company. Or the media. Or social media followers. It was for herself. A reminder. Something she never wanted to forget. At the top she wrote, "The day I learned the difference between looking important and being respected." Then she saved it. Not because she planned to share it. Because she needed to remember it. Months later, long after most people forgot the incident entirely, Melissa happened to see an interview clip online. Someone asked Keanu Reeves why people admired him so much. His answer was simple. Typically simple. He smiled and said, "I think everyone deserves a little kindness." That was it. No speech. No philosophy. Just a simple belief. Melissa watched the clip twice. Then a third time. Finally she smiled. Because now she understood. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. Enough to know that class wasn't determined by first-class tickets. Or expensive clothes. Or executive titles. Real class revealed itself when nobody had anything to gain. In patience. In humility. In kindness. In the way you treat people who can do nothing for you. Those were the things she spent years misunderstanding. And one overnight flight helped her finally see them clearly. Somewhere out there, Keanu Reeves was probably boarding another plane. Carrying the same old duffel bag. Treating flight attendants with respect. Helping strangers without making a scene. Living exactly the way he always had. And somewhere else, Melissa Hart was trying to do the same. Not because she met a celebrity. Because she met a better example of what a human being could be. And sometimes, one example is enough to change an entire life.